If turning scientific advice and expertise into good policy sounded wonky once upon a time, well, the pandemic has changed that. Now, lots of people are interested in that. Let's find out why it seems so hard to do. And as is our custom, we're going to introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Vulcan, Alberta. There's Ken Bosenkool. He's the J.W. McConnell Professor of Practice at McGill University's Max Bells School of Public Policy. He's also research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. In our nation's capital, Jennifer Robson, Associate Professor of Political Management at Carleton University. And in Woodbridge, Ontario, Erica Di Ruggiero, Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Global Health at the U of T's Dalla Lana School of Public Health, where she co-leads implementation science initiatives. And while I thank everybody for coming on the program, Erica, we got to start right there. What exactly is implementation science?
Well, I think it's a great question, but just simply put, implementation study is really about studying implementation bottlenecks in real world settings. And so it's really about trying to understand whether policies or programs are working, but for whom, under what circumstances, and whether they're actually scalable. And I would add equitable. If done well, this kind of science can actually help to strengthen policies and programs. I thought maybe a concrete example, given the current pandemic, might be helpful. And so let's just take our various vaccine rollout strategies. We're using different implementation science studies to really try to help shed light on social, political, and organizational factors that are actually helping us to roll it out, or things that are hindering. But the challenge is that we have so many health and social agencies involved in the rollout. It needs to deploy human and financial resources. And we know we're reaching some people and not reaching some people not so well. So evidence from implementation science studies can actually really help us understand some of those factors that hinder or enable implementation, and also who we're reaching or not reaching.
Jennifer, I don't mean this question to sound as naive as it might, but one might have thought that the process by which one puts together a policy idea, for example, a cabinet coming together and agreeing, here's what we ought to do, you would have thought that was 90% of the battle won right there, that implementation was sort of a given. Obviously, if there's a science of implementation, that's not the case. What's the distinction?
So you're absolutely right. There's a whole other process that takes over. There's a lot of work that is involved in coming up with policy options, ideas, even just recognizing what problems is government going to pay attention to. But once you get to the cabinet decision, then there's a whole other series of elements before we're actually in a world where shots are in arms, or money is out the door, or the legislation is passed. So you got to think in terms of if the policy is going to require legislative change, well, there's an parliamentary procedure you're going to have to go through. If it involves spending money in any way, shape, or form, there is a Treasury Board process that can be quite lengthy. If this is a policy area that requires intergovernmental cooperation, that is going to take some back and forth negotiation to reach agreements. If this is a policy that requires non-government actors, for example, a grants and contributions program that funds nonprofits to deliver certain goods and services, there's a whole process just to roll out the grant, to receive applications, to actually sign agreements with those third parties. So I've just given you a couple of different examples here, but I hope it conveys the idea that there are very few things in government where a minister or even a full cabinet can say, make it so, and somehow the world just magically rearranges itself. There's a lot of work involved in implementation.
It's not only given me a better picture of how this actually works, it's given me an enormous headache as well. This sounds really, really complicated. And I want to go to Ken next, because Ken, you've worked both on the research side of things, and you've worked in government as well for premiers, cabinet ministers, and so on. Can you give us a sense from both ends of that spectrum as to how it's worked in your experience?
Yeah, the idea generation usually comes from the sort of think tank or quasi-academic or even the political ground up process. And those ideas are things that then go through a party process, go through a leadership process, get into a platform. From a platform, they have to get through an election. People have to like what you're saying on balance. And then you get into government, hopefully, if you have enough things people like and your leader is acceptable to the broader public. And then you have to start thinking about what are the tools that you need to implement them. And it really helps when you get to that government stage if the people involved in writing the platform and coming up with the ideas have some experience in government. And I would say I'm on the conservative side of the political spectrum in Canada. There's probably 5 to 8 of us that have both government experience, implementation experience, and sort of work in the policy world that write platforms. And so whenever there's an election, one of the 5 or 8 of us get called and say, hey, can you come in and help us write a platform? So it's not a big group, but having the experience and the challenges that Jennifer just talked about with implementation, and then having the political experience about what kinds of ideas sell and how to position those ideas. And each one of those things is a step on a very long journey. All the way, I was involved in the creation of the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, and the promise was in all 4 political party platforms, and all 4 political parties wanted it to happen. And then Stephen Harper got elected and as one of the parties that wanted to make it happen. And it took 2 years of internal work to do, because there was federal provincial interfaces. There was, how do you create this agency? There was, how do you keep all of the various cancer bodies across Canada happy while you do it? It was just an enormous process to get it done. And today we have the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, but it was a 4-year process from having the idea to getting it done along all of those various steps of the way. So policy, everyone you talk to says, oh, the government should just do this. That's a lot harder to do than it is to say.
You tweaked something in my mind there. Let me do a quick follow-up. We've got an Ontario election in 54 weeks. You've pointed out you're one of a very small number of Conservatives who writes platforms. Are you going to write Doug Ford's platform for next year?
I haven't been asked, is I think the right answer. I wrote the platform of the leader that preceded Doug Ford, and I would say
Who's now the mayor of Brampton.
Ideas, who's now the mayor of Brampton, and many of the ideas that showed up in the People's Guarantee, which was a very popular platform. Many of the spending ideas made it into Doug Ford's platform, but not many of the revenue ideas made it into Doug Ford's platform, which gave them some governing challenges, shall we say, in their first budget.
Gotcha. Jennifer, back over to you. Let's talk about the public service, the bureaucracy, because they're obviously a huge part of this. In your view, in your experience, do they help or hinder getting things done in government?
Yeah, so I think anybody who's ever worked in government on the political side, or anybody who's watched Yes Minister, for example, suspects that actually the public service is kind of out to get you, right? Kind of out to actually stop you from doing things. My experience, and honestly, I did spend a bit of time in the federal public service. My experience is really that that's not really what's happening. The fact of the matter is, public servants are they serve the government that is elected. Whatever their own individual thoughts, preferences, and feelings about public policy, those are set aside. There can be institutional cultures, right, that make it difficult to move quickly or to be innovative or creative or problem solve at times. But I think actually what public servants are often facing are the myriad internal rules, right? So we have put in place a number of what's the word I'm looking for here? The sort of checks and balances within the system. Part of it is about maintaining accountability. And look, in a Western liberal democracy, we should not make it too easy for governments to do things. We want accountability. But some of those processes I was describing before, right, about implementing, whether it's spending money or passing legislation or just getting the authorization from Treasury Board, beneath each of those are multiple sub-processes, right? And the public service is organized in a way to respect those lines of accountability, to prioritize those lines of accountability. And, don't forget, at the end of the day, the elected government is there for a mandate, but the public servants are the ones that end up having to implement and live with the decisions made by the elected government. They're well aware they're not the decision makers, but I think that there's a keen interest in making sure that I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and so forth. And that can feel very much like a public service blocking action. I don't think that's actually the intent. I think what they're grappling with, again, are those myriad internal rules.
All right, Erica, let me try this with you then. I presume at some point in the past 14 months, given your area of expertise, you've been asked either by politicians or by bureaucrats to offer advice on some aspect of dealing with COVID-19. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's been more in the area of public policy and governance. And I'd like to echo what my colleagues have said already, that I think it's a very complex process and evidence is only one piece of it. And for those of us who work very closely with policymakers, we understand that evidence isn't always generated at the right time to inform the right decision. And I think part of that challenge is not knowing what decisions actually need evidence for. We're not always, in the know about that. And the best way to do that is to establish really close relationships. I think the other thing I want to mention is that bureaucrats really can provide some important continuity on files, because the issues we're talking about, health and social problems, and many other problems, need to take a long-term view, and we need a constant sort of focus on them, and the policy window may not always be open depending on who's in power. And so we need that longer term view to really address these complex problems, and they don't require simple solutions in many cases.
Let me do a follow-up with you, Erica, because I don't know, so I'm going to ask. At some point in the process, when you were providing advice to either politicians or bureaucrats, public servants, was there a moment where you said, okay, we're onto some good policy here, now go implement it, and you ran into the kind of roadblocks that you thought didn't make sense and implementation became a problem?
Well, not in recent history, but I would say that happens a lot. And I think one of the major issues, and this is on the research community as well, is having a better understanding of what the costs are of true implementation. And this is back to my earlier point about implementation science needing to also attend to what are the costs, what are the trade-offs, and who's going to benefit. And those kinds of assessments are actually really important to ensure more successful implementation.
We had from the Globe and Mail, their excellent health columnist and reporter, Andre Picard, on this program. We had him on just the other day, but I'm referring to something back in March where we talked about his latest book, which is all about fixing long-term care, which surely needs fixing. And here's an excerpt from that, apropos of our conversation here. If there's one thing Canada does better than any other country in the world, he writes, it is producing reports and recommendations on how to reform its health system. Since the advent of Medicare, there have been at least 150 inquiries, parliamentary hearings, task forces, and commission reports on the sad state of long-term care, home care, and elder care, not to mention media exposés, academic work, and cris de coeur from families. And yet, very few of the recommendations ever get implemented. The result is neglect by institutional indifference, a combination of bureaucratic inertia, constant political changing of the guard, and fear of change for which elders have paid a heavy price before and during the pandemic. Okay, let's dive into this. Mr. Bozenkool, why don't you get us started here? The biggest obstacles that stand in the way, of moving from solid research to recommendations to implementation to policy being enacted. What's the biggest problems?
I think when it comes to healthcare, there's a big political problem. And the big political problem is that when Canadians hear someone say they want to reform healthcare, because healthcare is so tied up in the Canadian identity outside of Quebec, I would add, that when politicians talk about changing healthcare, what Canadians hear is that they're going to change who they are. And there's a huge lobby in Canada to say any change to healthcare is moving to American-based healthcare, and we rightly suspect and are suspicious of American healthcare. And I think there's just been a huge political barrier to do reforms of healthcare, and it has to do with the fact that for many Canadians, healthcare is seen as part of who we are. And when politicians talk about changing it, there's anxiety among the public about that. And so politicians have been fearful to tread in this area. Erica is closer to it from the research side, obviously, but I would just say my political background, maybe particularly being a conservative, the public is very anxious about hearing conservatives talk about reforming healthcare because they see this bad example south of the border and they hear horror stories and they just hear anxiety about it. So there's a reluctance at the political level to do things in healthcare. And I think that's part of the challenge, even for long-term care.
Jennifer, do you want to pick up the story there? Because surely public fears or public concerns, nervousness about change have to be taken into account when a politician or a government is trying to roll something out. But I mean, on the other side of it, the definition of leadership is leading. How much of that is a factor in what we're talking about here?
So specifically to healthcare, I think another important element here is the requirement for intergovernmental cooperation. And a huge part of the oxygen around healthcare policy debates and whatnot tends to get sucked up by arguments over healthcare transfers. And so Steve, you made the point about, well, what about leadership? And I think part of the issue here, of course, is that leadership on many aspects of healthcare is in fact an area of shared jurisdiction. And that also means negotiating shared political credit, right? And also negotiating around, decision-making power and influence there. So even if we have one order of government that says, that's it, I'm marching forward, I'm leading the charge, for example, on long-term care. The fact of the matter is we live in a decentralized federation. The fact of the matter is fiscal federalism is a thing in Canada. So really, they need dance partners, right, to be able to move forward. There's no way that a single leader is going to be able to fundamentally make reforms on their own.
Well, on the theory that it takes two to tango, Ken, let me get you to follow up with this. And I'm going to throw a few things your way on this one, Ken. In the last Ontario budget, it was announced that a task force would be set up to examine barriers women face in the workplace. And then we saw Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland launch a task force on women in the economy. And the feds also set up a $20 million secretariat on early learning and childcare. And again, this gets back to leadership and whether it takes two to tango. The eternal question, do we look at these as genuine attempts to find new information and move the yardsticks forward, or more likely genuine attempts to rag the puck and not have to do anything?
Yeah, again, from my political background, there's two reasons to study something. The first reason is to learn more, and the second reason is as an excuse to not do anything. And I think every government has found themselves in both of those situations where either because of the external environment or because of the politics of an issue, they just prefer not to have to address it. So they'll study it to make it go away. But I think there are many studies that have been done that have actually led to better policy. And if we have, I think long-term care, there's lots of studies around about what the challenges are, but there's also big disagreements on what the solutions are. And so, if Ottawa wants to do something, it has a government of a certain persuasion, and if Ontario wants to do something, it has a government of a different persuasion, and they may not agree on how to move forward on these issues. And then you have which government is responsible for funding, which government is responsible for delivering, and it becomes, again, a very complicated situation to work our way out of.
Well, Erica, let me come at it from a different way. And that is, in your judgment, how good are governments at using data to judge the effectiveness of a program once that program has been implemented? And then if they see shortcomings along the way, make adjustments as you go?
Well, I think it depends. I would say that during the pandemic, we actually saw some of the cracks in our data systems. In some cases, we did not have very good access to timely data. And this is where academics had to step up to the plate and fill that gap. That being said, we also saw an exponential growth in the number of science tables that were created, which in theory create opportunities for generating and asking for science advice, and to hopefully use that in decision making. But how that data is used, who's asking for the data, how well it's also communicated to the public, what kind of data sharing agreements, which is not a new idea, but because of our federal, provincial, territorial makeup, I don't think we share data very well, especially when we want a national view on a problem, and that's an area that needs improvement.
Well, Jennifer, let's do a real life example here. The iPhone. Everybody knows that the iPhone that's out today and the one that first got on the market, they are not the same iPhone. And Apple somehow manages to get a phone out there. And then when they make improvements, they improve it. And then they improve it a little more and a little more. Can government do that?
Sure, government can.
But do
It's
they?
not, but do they? Look, there are examples that I can think of where governments have made incremental and positive changes. So, for example, changes to maternity and parental leave under employment insurance, right? That's a story of incremental policy change that has improve the duration and the value of the benefit. More to do, absolutely more to do in terms of reforms there, but that is one example where government has actually made incremental positive progress. I would say this, if you think about the capabilities of government, and I think this is actually something that my colleague raised in terms of access to data and data sharing, that's a huge part of it. But it's actually even more fundamental, right? It's about, do we have good data literacy within governments? Do we have information management and IT systems that can actually gather and handle and crunch data? Do we also incorporate data into our decision-making processes? So if you think back to those Treasury Board processes and decisions by cabinet that we talked about at the outset, those are all very much guided by forms and templates, right? And if we're not doing the work to think about what is the information that has to go into the form, it doesn't make its way in, and then it can't by default be incorporated into decision making. There are, of course, also cases where you have constituencies that form around particular programs, that there are constituencies who are quite attached to the status quo, and change or adaptation can mean a loss for some who are currently benefiting from a given public policy, even if it would actually increase the net benefit more broadly to the rest of society. And I'm thinking about, for example, tax reform, right? That is one that has been proven time and time again to be very difficult for governments to actually make significant progress on. What we see instead are sort of these smaller stepwise changes that may, depending on your perspective, be steps forward or steps backward. But I am kind of reminded of, I think it was MacDonald, former finance minister, who got up in the House and, after being completely lambasted for presenting a plan on tax reform, said, we've listened to Canadians and they like better the double they know than the double they don't. So, there could be some of that dynamic at play here as well.
Is that Donald MacDonald from like 45 years ago?
Yes, that is exactly who I'm thinking of. Thank you.
Gotcha. Not at all. All right, let me play some tape here. And actually, it's not tape anymore. I don't know why I say that. It's all digital, right? Old habits die hard. SARS, 18 years ago, recommendations emerged from that on how to make sure that kind of crisis didn't happen again. And certainly over the past year, many people have been asking the question, those were perfectly good recommendations. Why have we not implemented them? We had a guest on this program not that long ago named Carolyn Collane, a mathematician, epidemiologist, Simon Fraser University, and she had this to say about that back in March. Roll it, please, Tony.
It's a little harder to sell preventing the problem that you don't have yet than it is to sell solving a huge problem that you do have. So opening a new building or whatever is more direct, more concrete, more tangible. It has a name. It can have a donor with a name on it. Whereas preventing a huge problem that you don't have is a much harder motivation. Hopefully now, recognizing that in the last 2 decades, we've seen SARS, MERS, Ebola virus, Zika virus, H1N1 flu, and now, of course, COVID-19, maybe we will start to think about public health capacity and health security in a more proactive way.
Ken, I do want to find out from you and your experience working inside governments about how difficult it is to get the system, for lack of a better expression, to focus on preventing disaster as opposed to cleaning up disaster.
Yeah, I think she nailed it. There's a tyranny of the current. And there's, when you're in a political job, the headlines of the day and the issues of the day and the challenges of the day just take up such an inordinate amount of your time. And now we'll go through this. We'll go through this crisis, the health crisis that we're in now, and we'll maybe over plan for the next one, and then in our entire data system will go down instead of another health crisis, as we're seeing with Line 5 in the United States. Some hacking attack is threatening our infrastructure, and so there's there are so many, Dan Gardner is a academic, a writer who talks a lot about risk planning and how do you assess the size of the risk and how do you develop a proportionate planning response. And I don't think there's easy answers. What I do know is that when you're in the political world, the tyranny of the current is so dominant. I think we need in government to have groups of people, whether it's bureaucrats and others, planning these things and actually moving them forward, but getting political attention and getting financial attention to some of these things when there's constantly pressure to do what the latest pressures are on government makes these planning exercises very difficult.
Well, Jennifer, why don't you follow up on this? Because I guess, or you tell me, it's hard to remember a program that was so big and so comprehensive and got rushed out the door so quickly and seemed to do a pretty reasonably good job than the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Can you compare what happened there to the typical, we're going to research, we're going to collect data, we're going to roll out a program, we're going to see how it goes, et cetera, that governments and bureaucracies, the amount of time that normally takes?
Yeah, CERB was basically invented overnight, wasn't it? And it was invented out of necessity. So maybe I'll do the comparison with employment insurance, because that was the system that failed and created the necessity to create something in its place, at least temporarily. And a typical time frame for employment insurance changes, even really modest changes. I'm not talking about comprehensive system reform here. I'm talking about, maybe changes to the duration of a special benefit, for example. Not uncommon, honestly, for that process to take upwards of a year, 18 months. I think, for example, when the Liberal government was elected in 2015, they did promise that they would make, again, another incremental change to parental benefits, part of the EI system. And I don't think that was actually out the door until about 2017, because there was a need for public consultations. There was a need for legislative change. This had spending implications, which meant a trip to Treasury Board and to get approvals. Then there's all the behind the scenes work that's involved in terms of altering systems and information that's provided to the public. And a lot of that we saw rushed, right, with CERB, which unfortunately led to, some confusion for some users of the program. And I think we're going to be learning some important lessons for implementation as a result of what the government went through, and also what Canadians experienced as a result of that program. I think you're right, Steve, that it was something that was done really quickly. By and large, it made a huge difference in terms of household financial stability. The fact that we are where we are right now in terms of a pathway around economic recovery, I think, is in no small measure due to the spending and the inclusive program design that was created. But I think about all of those folks who received the letters from the Canada Revenue Agency saying, you got to pay us back $10,000. That's an example, right, of an unintended consequence that was not anticipated back in March 2020 when they were first standing up that program. And those are some of the kinds of things that I think we need to be paying attention to as we go forward and think about what are the kinds of social policies and programs we want for the next phase in this country.
Well, Ken, it raises a question for me. Is this a one-off just because of the utterly unique circumstances in which CERB was created? Or is this potentially a new way forward of doing policy and making programs?
I think a lot of the normal rules around policy design were appropriately thrown out the window. For example, we did a program for CERB that was trust, then verify. And Jennifer has written some really good stuff about this. But I think that was the right decision. I proposed in early March last year that we do a universal basic income during the course of the pandemic. And the reason was I wasn't confident that the systems in government would be able to get a system up in place as quickly as they managed to do. So I was wrong about that. Jennifer was right about much of that. I'm not shy to say. But I think this idea that we do a program where we trust a whole bunch of people to just apply, or we just send out checks and we'll verify later, in a normal situation, that's not the kind of policy you want to develop, but the necessity made that was the necessary policy at the time. And I think it was successful. We'll be ironing out some of the challenges as a result of that trust, but verify later system for a long time. But as Jennifer said, we did the right thing. We saved a lot of families, a lot of financial distress, and I'm glad we did it.
In which case, Erica, in our last couple of minutes here, let's talk about looking forward to improve policy implementation. What advice would you offer to researchers making the recommendations, politicians deciding what goes forward, what doesn't? Go ahead, give us your best shot.
Well, that's a big question. I think it depends, but I guess one of the things I would like to pick up on, which is the CERB example, is we responded in a crisis, we innovated, we threw out some of the rigid rules, which was appropriate, as others have said. How can we learn from that pilot, if you will, and is it worth sustaining? And so it kind of speaks to a point around scaling up. You know, under what conditions should we be scaling up new innovations that have come out of crises like this? The second point is we need to invest in public health, which is the prevention part of the system. So the previous quote that you had from Carolyn was spot on. You can't measure what you don't see. You know, take a leap of faith. We're going to prevent problems in the future. However, we've been here before. And so how do we sustain attention on public health and do some proper investing in the prevention side of the system? Even the public health arm of the healthcare system was positioned in a way to save hospitals. We can't overwhelm our intensive care units. Don't get me wrong, that was very important, but it is the part of the system that gets the lowest amount of money, relatively speaking. And I think we need to really do a better job of investing in the prevention part of the system so that we don't find ourselves in the same position, and research on effective policies and programs.
Well, I have to say, this is one of my favorite kind of agenda programs where we get deep into the weeds, we get very policy wonkish, and it's kind of like for nerds only. So well done, you three. Ken Bosencool, Jennifer Robson, Erica Di Ruggiero. It's great to have all three of you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.